Hello and welcome to Britain's in History. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be exploring King Arthur, a name so steeped in the fog of myth and legend that it obscures the history which it rests on. Arthur is a cultural touchstone, a figure who's become an everlasting symbol in the British psyche. Whether we see him as the epitome of the ideal king, embodying virtues such as honour, chivalry and justice, or as a beacon of hope and cultural continuity in times of turmoil, Arthur's legacy is proven to be as enduring as it is a source of cultural remembrance. As Alan Wilson once said, if it wasn't for the memory of Arthur, all of British Welsh histories would have been lost forever. The popularised legendary Arthur kicks off with Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, where his heroic deeds are brought to the audience of the Norman courts. Arthuriana has a resurgence with Sir Thomas Malory in the 15th century, and was repurposed again in the Victorian revival with Alfred Tennyson's The Ideal King, who wished to use the Arthurian myth to repurpose these values for the Victorian age. This was also reflected visually in artwork from the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Arthur also has a 20th century revival in cinema also. The Arthurian tradition has earned its place as one of the most influential in the land. It is fair to say that the Arthurian epos in many ways contributed to shaping not only the British culture, but Western culture more broadly. France, Germany, Italy, Spain and Portugal are to name but a few of the cultures which have been touched and influenced by what is essentially a literary amalgamation of British Welsh cultural values, history and folklore. Today I'm going to demonstrate how South East Wales can claim this historical figure, and how these histories are based in real history, which the popular folktales have done a great job of exporting, but have however unfortunately also aided in obfuscating the reality which lurks beneath. Many within Britain today have at least heard of Arthur, but many often dismiss the possibilities of his real existence. There was no such thing as King Arthur, you will often hear, of course referring to the fact that there has been no English king under that name, which is correct.
Who goes there? It is I, Arthur, son of Uther Pendragon from the castle of Camelot, king of the Britons, defeater of the Saxons, sovereign of all England. Pull the other one.
How do you do?
How do you do, good lady? I am Arthur, king of the Britons. Whose castle is that?
King of the who?
The Britons.
Who are the Britons?
Well, we all are. We are all Britons. And I am your king.
I didn't know we had a king.
We can't blame people for this confusion, because we've always been told that Arthur was king of all England, which is incorrect. However, he was High King of the Britons and united Britain under one banner. If we look at the most influential piece of Arthurian literature, Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, here we find Arthur as depicted as King of England. The contradictions arise immediately when he is also depicted as defending his kingdom from Saxon invaders, the people understood today largely as being the Proto-English. How can Arthur be defending his own country from his own people who are invading from Germany? Malory's choice of England and not Britain is interesting, as English is an identity closely linked with the Anglo-Saxons, the very people Arthur was fighting against. You could argue that this is just a simple case of medieval anachronism and appropriation, whereby labels are used incongruently with their time and place. I think that this is the case. However, I argue that Malory may have been subtly alluding to the Loegrian or Brythonic element within the English population, which modern genetics demonstrates makes up the majority of the English genome. Loegrian is a British Welsh term for the pre-Saxon culture of what is now modern England, and is used as a word to refer to modern England to this day. What is worth noting here is that Sir Thomas Malory supported the Lancastrian claim during the process which would see a Welshman take the throne of England, which may explain why he wished to align Arthur, a relic of British Welsh resistance, with Englishness. Le Morte d'Arthur was published in 1485 The same year, Henry VII was crowned King of England. As High King of the Britons, or Pendragon of the island, Arthur would have had Loigrins in his ranks, which, to Malory, might have been his own justification for fashioning him King of England. This is just an idea. The title King of England is of course anachronistic and incorrect, whichever way we look at it. England didn't exist until the 10th century, and Arthur was definitely Welsh and from the 6th century. This is one of the many confusions to unravel. Another confusion is a huge gap between the events within Arthurian literature of Arthur's epic deeds. This was pointed out by Vatican historian Polydore Virgil to Henry VII when he was re-evaluating British history. Arthur is said to have invaded Western Europe from Britain to overthrow Emperor Gratian and to have fought the incoming Saxons. Alan Wilson and Barber and Blackett identified this impossible 200-year gap and subsequently discovered that many historians before them have made the argument that King Arthur of legend has to be a compound of two historical people. A medieval mistake, as Alan puts it. I would argue, however, that the mixing of these events of the two different people could be an intentional aim to celebrate the achievements of a certain royal bloodline. Wilson and Blackett have demonstrated how the events within Arthurian literature are constituted between one Androgathius, son of the Roman Emperor Magnus Maximus, and his wife, the British Welsh princess Cyndric. Androgathius led the rebellion of the Western Empire from his father's seat of power in Britain, and his 6 times patrilineal descendant, Athrwys or Artorious, son of Meurig, king of Glamorgan in Gwent, and his knights make up the rest of the events, such as the battles at Longborth, Camelot and Baden, which can all be located in Wales. In abstraction, the Androgathius-Athrwys compound can account for the theme of Arthur being half Welsh and half Roman, as depicted often in literature and cinema. Some may ask, how do we get Athrwys from Arthur? The fact that the two names aren't obviously identical will be problematic for some, so let me untangle this one. If we look at Athrwys at Meurig in different land charters and genealogies, we can find this king of Glamorgan in Gwent was recorded in both Welsh and Latin, which harbour different spellings. Athrwys has been recorded as Artorious in the Harleian Genealogies of 950. This same king is recorded in the Book of Llandaff as Arthurius, and Artorious is the name used in the Latin version of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae as the equivalent of Arthur. Geoffrey of Monmouth is responsible for the popularisation of Arthur, so yes, it is that easy to get Arthur from Athrwys. It is also important to note that these references are much older than Geoffrey of Monmouth. The most common complaint regarding Athrwys as Arthur is his dating in the Welsh genealogies, which place him in the 7th century. Essentially, in the Book of Llandaff there is a 100-year gap between Morgan, son of Athrwys, and Morgan Maganwg, who are two separate people who lived 100 years apart from each other. The original compiler of the Book of Llandaff had essentially conflated both of these kings into one historical figure, which closed the gap of 100 years, which brought the entire genealogy dating forward by that amount, subsequently placing Athrwys in the 7th century, 100 years too late to be the King Arthur. This was identified by J.W. Williams in his 1970 revision of the Book of Llandaff, which is in the National Library of Wales, bringing Athrwys back into the 6th century, where we can find other references to this king. For example, the 6th century life of St Cadoc or Llancarvan in Glamorgan, who lived between 500 and 580, also famously records Arthur. The written Latin of which the life is recorded recites both Athrwys and Artorious when describing King Arthur. Given the spellings evident in Cadoc's life, I think it's fair to say that we're talking about Athrwys, who was a contemporary to Cadoc. To use both of these spellings can help us make sense of why Arthur is sometimes called Artorious. When we consult the collection of Welsh folk tales in the Mabinogi, for traces of Arthur, we can find that the Welsh traditions remember Caerleon in Gwent as King Arthur's favourite court. This was also stated by Geoffrey of Monmouth and Chrétien de Troyes. What is also interesting is that the same set of folktales also remember Caerleon as the favourite court of Magnus Maximus, his 7 times patrilineal ancestor, according to the Black Book of Carmarthen. This replicates the link between the two in folklore as it is represented in Geoffrey of Monmouth. There is an Iron Age hill fort at Caerleon, 1.5 miles away from the famous amphitheatre. This hill fort was excavated in 2000 by the University of Wales. It was dated to the early Middle Iron Age, but it also had evidence of Neolithic settlement due to pieces of worked flint which were found. The excavation also showed that it was most likely used in the late Roman and post-Roman periods, which is a huge continuum of usage. But this length of usage makes Lodge Hill a likely candidate for the location of the courts of Arthur and Maxim, who might have utilised the amphitheatre as a round table, suggested by the historical traditions and ordnance survey maps from the 19th century. Arthur is also recorded in the life of St Dubricus, Archbishop of Wales, who crowned him at Caerleon. These examples show the inextricable connection between the Arthur recorded in folktales and ecclesiastical records and the historical Athrwys, who was king in the area during the time these saints were alive. The tradition of Athrwys at Meurig being Arthur has an extensive genealogy, which has been collated by Wilson and Blackett. The Brutes of England, written between the 13th and 15th centuries, also records Arthur, spelt Arthwyr, as being king of Glamorgan and Gwent. Arthur is placed as king of Glamorgan and Gwent in the Cambrian Triumphans, written by Percy Enderbie for Charles II in 1661. In Avalon Debate in 1760, King Arthur is stated to be Arthur, son of Meurig. Not only is Arthur II identified, but Uther Pendragon is explained as a title, which means head ruler. In 1776, the history of Monmouthshire again lists these South Wales kings in a volume written by David Williams of Oxford. This includes Magnus, Tudrig, Meurig and Arthur. In fact, Arthur is clearly identified as the predecessor of Morgan ap Artorious mentioned earlier. Samuel Lewis, in his Topographical Dictionary of Wales, published in 1833, states that Arthur was king of Glamorgan and son of Meurig ap Tudrig. The entry on Llandaff reads, "The first church on this place was built by Tudrig at Tyfelt, commonly called Tudrig, the martyr grandson of the renowned King Arthur." In 1834, John H. Parry published his work, The Cambrian Plutarch, stating that King Arthur was a son of Meurig ap Tudrig, a prince of the Silurian Britons, at the commencement of the 6th century. We also have to consider the school book, The Story of Gwent, written in 1908, which depicts Athrwys ap Meurig as King Arthur, which was the official curriculum in Welsh schools until 1921. The sudden removal of King Arthur from the curriculum in Wales was a curious one. It's worth noting here that the Irish Revolution could have contributed to the histories of Arthur being removed from the curriculum. The Welsh nationalist movement was beginning to take shape simultaneously to the establishment of the Irish Free State, which eventually led to Plaid Cymru taking form in 1925. Maybe the British establishment wished to eliminate possible relics of Welsh nationalism to prevent any possibility of losing Wales as well as Ireland. Welsh education had been brought closer into the control of the London-centric establishment in the 19th century, following a harsh scrutiny of the Welsh education system known as the Treachery of the Blue Books, which deemed Welsh education unfit and immoral. With Welsh education in a monitored position, it may have been just too risky for the British establishment to permit Welsh school children to know their rightful connection to the historical King Arthur, in fears that it might support nationalist sentiment. If you visit Llandaff Cathedral today, you're encountered by a stained glass window which depicts King Arthur next to the grandfather of Athrwys ap Meurig, Tudrig ap Tyfelt, clearly pinning Arthur to a specific personage and bloodline. The Arthurian legacy of South East Wales is clearly remembered here. What's interesting is that this window was installed in 1921, the very same year that Arthur was taken from the school books. In 1930, Nash Williams uncovered an inscribed stone at Ogmore Castle, a location steeped in Arthurian legend. The stone is said to be 10th century, and it bears the name of Arthmail, which, although it doesn't sound exactly the same as Arthur or Athrwys, it translates as Bear Prince, which for all intents and purposes can resemble Arthur, who is sometimes referred to as the Bear King. Given that it is generally agreed upon that this stone is commemorating a 6th century king, Athrwys must be considered due to the Arthurian connection with the surrounding landscape. Ogmore itself is remembered as one of the places Arthur gathered his forces. There is a story of him being splashed by a boy on a horse by the river, which he graciously laughed off, earning Arthur the epithet generous. This is an epithet which is also attributed to his son and successor Morgan, which contributes to the notions of Arthurian chivalry. In some traditions, Arthur's body is also said to have flown up the Ueni River past Ogmore, en route to the location where he would be buried, meaning that this location is significant. What is also worth noting is that although Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote Historia Regum Britanniae under the request of Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, who asked him to translate an Old Welsh book, which by the way was finally located by Sir William Flinders Petrie, which is visible in his 1917 paper Neglected British History, absolving Geoffrey of the accusations of forgery. We can see that Geoffrey dedicated his works to the half-Welsh, half-Norman Robert Earl of Gloucester, the illegitimate son of Henry I, who is believed to have had an affair with Nest, daughter of Euston ap Gwrgan, the last independent king of Morgannwg. Geoffrey, being a man who hailed from this kingdom, may have had vested interests in seeing the Glamorgan and Gwent royal line acceded to the English throne. Popularising the Welsh stories to the Norman court would be one way of preparing for this potentiality. This means that the birthing of Arthurian literature offers them glaringly. As Peter has demonstrated before on this channel, Longborth could well be Llanborth in West Wales. When looking on maps, it has a Bedd Geraint locally, which means the grave of Geraint. This location is south of Camelot in Dalgellau, a place which has been agreed upon as the battle sites of Camelot by Wilson and Blackett, Barber and Pykitt and Graham Phillips. Camelot is where Arthur is said to have been mortally wounded. We also have Mynydd Baden, or Baden Hill, in South Wales, which in the literary tradition is said to be inland from the Severn. Mynydd Baden is 7 miles from the Severn estuary, making it a clear candidate. What's more is that Mynydd Baden is in an area called Maes Cadlawr, which translates as the field of the battle site. Richard Johnson has demonstrated that these ideas did not originate with Wilson and Blackett and can be dated back to at least the 19th century in Hans Morgannwg by Dafydd Morgannwg. The King Arthur narrative is a story which by all means should have been heretical to the Church. What with its associations with the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, with them entwined with the notions of a young Jesus coming to Britain with Joseph of Arimathea, his uncle. The motif of a once and future king is Gnostic to the core. This pertains to the presence of the pre-Roman Catholic Christianity in Britain, which we've discussed in other videos. The church at St Peter Super Montum, which was excavated by Dr. Eric Talbot in 1990, shows 5 layers of archaeology dating back to the early centuries, where 2 beehive hermitages were found, which most likely belonged to Chaldee Gnostics, which had their place within the British Church until the 11th century. The reiteration of a Christed bloodline returning from the ether to save the country in its hour of need is immortalised by the Mabdarrigan tradition, which again reiterates this Gnostic vein in the Welsh medieval society. This epithet was afforded to various leaders throughout Welsh and British history, King Arthur being the first, followed by Llewellyn ap Griffith, Owain the Red Hand of Lawgoch, Owain Glyndwr, and finally Henry VII. On a side note, what is interesting about all of these men is that they're actually all related to each other. There is one more who had the epithet Mabdarrigan, and that was Henry VIII, but he gave it to himself. Another great deception which must be considered is the Tudor machination during his reign. Henry VIII, like his father, equipped ideas of Welsh heritage to support his own claim to the throne, namely by making a big deal out of his descent from Brutus, the first king of the Britons, and making Arthurian references throughout his royal character, in the same vein as his father Henry. John Leyland took an interest in Arthurian matters and travelled to many of the locations associated with King Arthur in Wales and the West Country. However, he found gaps in knowledge in some of the locations, such as Camelot, which he took to be Cadbury Hill in North Somerset, one of the many hill forts in the west of Britain. This idea was originated by William of Malmesbury, who is also responsible for our modern day associations between Arthurian themes and Glastonbury in Somerset, which is based in the Domesday Book entry in 1086, which states that 12 hides of marshy land never paid tax, as it was given as a gift to Joseph of Arimathea by King Artorious. This led to the idea that Glastonbury must be the fabled Avalon, where the 1st century St Illid is said to have remembered by the Welsh, as Joseph resided upon death. Arthur, who went to Avalon after the Battle of Camelot, after being mortally wounded. This results in the idea that Glastonbury is Avalon, unquestionably. This set of circumstances provided Henry II with the opportunity to align himself with the deep structure metaphysical narrative of Britain during a time when his popularity was in a precarious position after stories of the murder of Thomas of Becket spread like wildfire. A fire broke out in Glastonbury Abbey in 1191, which devastated the abbey. During the reconnaissance of the abbey, which was overseen by Henry, 2 skeletons were found, which were dubbed the remains of Arthur and Guinevere, which Henry took as his portents of his right to rule. This is indicative of the Norman Plantagenet obsession with the Arthurian metaphysic, but also the willful intent to have physical ownership over it as a possession. Barber and Pykitt take a different view on the location of Avalon. Avalon first appears in Arthuriana with Geoffrey of Monmouth. Despite the iconic presence of Avalon within the Arthurian epos, the island is only mentioned twice in Historia Regum Britanniae. Once as the place which forged Caliburn, or Excalibur, Arthur's sword of near supernatural significance, but also the place where Arthur is taken after he's mortally wounded at the Battle of Camelot. In 1185, Avalon becomes associated with Morgan Le Fay, who's more often than not Arthur's sister, the enchantress in charge of the Holy Island in Monmouth's Vita Melini. Monmouth also describes the island as being inhabited by 8 of Morgan's sisters, all of them skilled in the healing arts. This is a clear resonance with the British and Irish traditions of 9 maidens. Avalon breaks down etymologically into Aval-lon, which translates as the island of apples. Therefore, this naturally means that we are looking for an island containing apple trees. which is the view taken by Barber and Pykitt. It has been said by scholars to be an island facing the Annwn, the British otherworld, which is often characterised by bodies of water much like the relationship between Oceanus and Hesperides in Greek myth. Annwn has a special connection with the sun setting in the west over Ireland, meaning Avalon is most likely facing the Emerald Isle. It would also make sense for Avalon to be relatively close to the battle site of Camelot. Regarding this criteria, Barber and Pykitt offer a good and fair suggestion for the corporeal Avalon in Bardsey Island, just off the coast of the Llyn Peninsula. Bardsey meets the aforementioned criteria and furthermore has the status of a holy island, as it's recorded that 20,000 saints are buried there, which demonstrates this status. I think then that it is also arguable, judging by this criteria, that Holyhead, or both Holyhead and Anglesey, should be considered as contenders for this possibility of Avalon as well. Inismon was recorded by Tacitus and Julius Caesar as being the centre of Druidic life in Britain, which would arguably resonate with the magic healing arts of Morgan Le Fay more intimately. What's more is that Holyhead has a Triarthur Bay on its west coast. Triarthur translates as the town or resort of Arthur. Arthur is depicted in an Ordnance Survey map in 1888. It is curious that the shore should hold a hearkening resonance to Arthur. It must also be said that Holyhead and Anglesey are roughly similar distance away from the battle site at Camelot, meaning that they naturally fall into this criterion. What is also essential to note about the discussions of Avalon in North Wales is another classical name attributed to the region. The region of Wales, which is home to both Gwynedd, Anglesey and Bardsey, is Gwynedd. If we break down Gwynedd to extract meaning, we get Gwyn and Nedd. Gwyn is white and Nedd is neath, as in beneath. This could represent white lands, as in the land beneath your feet, which feature in the quest of the Holy Grail in the Vulgate cycle. What is essential to note is this symbolic representation of Arthur's marriage to Guinevere within Arthurian legend, and how they relate to the history. The historical Athrwys is recorded to have been married to Gwen Nedd Lon Verch Braffael. Her first name is certainly within keeping of this white land motif. However, Wilson and Blackett suggest that he had 3 wives, which they found were all recorded as being named Gwyn Hafar. When we break down the meaning of Gwyn Hafar, according to the 1688 dictionary, it again translates directly to white land. This further supports the aforementioned motif. This also begs a question regarding whether Guinevere or Gwyn Hafar was a title rather than a given name. I suggest that it most probably was, due to Athrwys having 3 wives with this epithet. It is arguable then that Arthur seems to be inextricably connected to motifs of the white land metaphysic within place names. What is astonishing is that Athrwys also had 3 common war lives as well, meaning that by coincidence, Athrwys at Meurig and Henry VIII of England shared a pattern of 6 wives. When we consider how much Henry and his father aligned themselves with the Arthurian epos, this becomes an interesting parallel. With all of these deep resonances within the Welsh landscape pertaining to the history which inform the legends, we have to ask whether or not a discussion of the values of this society are what inspired the spread of the tales as much as the figure of the heroic historical King Arthur. What the Britons had during the time of Arthur was a highly sophisticated codex of laws known as the Monmouthshire laws, which were codified in the 5th century by Dynval Monmouth. Laws such as the chief of the tribe must be the oldest efficient man of the tribe resonates with the archetypal motif of the Fisher King, showing how potency and vigour in character resemble kingship rather than mere entitlement of inherited titles. Other laws such as the right of sanctity or sanctuary and the right of the protection of the innocent and the right of the road, as well as the rights of land inheritance. The Monmouthshire laws included provisions regarding the inheritance of land and property, ensuring that land was passed down within families according to the established customs and rights. We have trial by jury, fair punishment, compensation for harm, and women's rights. Some interpretations of the laws said that they granted women certain rights, such as the ability to own property and receive compensations to wrongs done to them. There's also protection of property and respect for contracts. The Monmouthshire laws emphasise the importance of honouring agreements and contracts, establishing a legal framework for business and personal dealings. To me at least, these laws reflect the values of the Britons, as recorded in the early Welsh legal culture, which is further solidified by Hywel Dda in the 10th century, 200 years before Geoffrey of Monmouth. They resemble the idealised Arthurian morality within Geoffrey of Monmouth, which was attractive to the Victorians, as mentioned earlier. I am by no means attempting to conflate the historical Arthur with the legendary Arthur, as Athrwys at Meurig had some elements in his real history which were a far cry from the ideal king, of course being a 6th century warlord. I respect the separateness. However, I am suggesting that the values evident in Arthuriana could well be a fanciful or idealised retelling of societal values of the Britons, which are evident in their laws. If you're interested in starting your journey into discovering the history which underpins King Arthur, then please head to our online bookstore, where you will find that Artorious Rex Discovered by Wilson and Blackett has just been reprinted. Thanks for listening, and Hedwch.